this message wherever you stand. I'm calling every woman, calling every man. We're the generation, we can't afford to wait. The future started yesterday, and we're already late. We've been looking for a song to sing, we search for a melody.
Good morning, Detroit. My name is Marshall Bryant, and I am one of your hosts of Empowered Living. Also,
good morning, Detroit. I am Laura Sallin, another one of your hosts of Empowered Living.
all right, today we are happy that you are back with us. We have a phenomenal show ahead. It's a very informative show, and it is about the parallels of incarceration and immigration. So we've got a lot of background information putting this show together, and it was, oh my God, it was an emotional situation. I mean, there's no way you can hear the background information because there's always two sides to every story.
Right.
Of course, you always hear the one that, you know, people with the upper hand, they give the most information in their side, but to actually hear about what's going on and how people are affected, it's a totally different story. And
Yeah. Well, also, Marshall, what was eye-opening is that when we were speaking with some of these superb guests that were coming on later, and the information that they were sharing with us was, like you said, it was heart-wrenching.
yeah,
How realistic the experiences that they had to go through with their families, and the other thing too, which was kind of eye-opening, is that the political effectiveness with the this peril situation.
right.
It's just it's still mind blowing to this day. You know.
Yeah, it was something to put the transcript together, to do the research and just everything, and it was just, I had to constantly take breaks. Like, this is a lot.
You can have an emotional breakdown
Yeah,
almost, just with the experiences or the knowledge or the information that was bestowed upon us. You know, you be almost not human,
Right.
not to take this something, well, not personal, but emotionally.
Yeah,
you know.
it was emotional because it was one time I didn't even say anything. While we were talking, I put the phone on mute, and I was like, it was a couple of tears coming, like, oh my
Absolutely,
God, I can't
absolutely,
believe this.
absolutely. Like I said, we were talking off camera. You had to really. It just makes you think too. It makes you think about what this world is going through. Some of the people that, I don't want to say the unforgotten people, but that's the term I'm using now because I don't know. It's just some things are unexplained and no reason why
Right.
that this is a reality.
Well, I need to benefit off of you, but I don't need to see you. I don't need to know that you exist, how you exist, what affects you, because morally, if you get into that, it is emotional, and there's no way as a human being you could do that to another human being. So, you know, it's
Not
really
consciously.
deep. Not,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, not consciously. You like you said, we'll be talking off camera before. How do these people sleep at night? How can you constantly sleep at night knowing that you, in a way, are playing God with these people's lives,
Right.
and these families that are being affected and torn apart because of some idiotic policies, or it's just senseless to me.
It's not policies, it's money.
Yes, you're exactly right. It's just, I guess that's the bottom line.
It's money.
That's the bottom line. It's about the almighty dollar. So,
All right. Well, we won't get too deep on our soapbox
Right.
already, because, I mean, it's going to get deep,
have
Detroit.
to get the Kleenex box out.
Exactly. I'll be crying again. We are at the end of the school year.
Amen. Amen.
Oh,
Amen.
my God.
Amen.
We love
Yeah.
the children, but
Yes.
I think they're tired. They're ready
They're
to go.
tired of us.
They're
We're
ready-
tired of them.
Yeah, but
It's a two-way street.
yeah,
It's a
you know,
two-way street.
so, you know, it's that time we get rejuvenated and then we go right back to it again. But, you know, that's an emotional time, too, because ceremonies, our 5th grade promotion ceremony, I know 8th grade.
8th grade has we're they're next Monday, and then there's the 8th grade dance, and then I was fortunate enough too to be invited by some of my former students who went to their proms.
Okay.
So we send them off, and the proms now is just it's a lot what they're doing now with the proms.
It is. I saw on social media this young lady went to her prom in a casket, and
no, you got to be kidding me.
No, I'm going to show it to you. I showed another friend. She didn't believe me, and I said, "You are not going to believe me." Yes, she had.
She laid down in it.
Yes. And it was on social media. I couldn't believe it. Another friend was like, "You are not telling me the truth." I was like, "Yes, I am." I sent it to her. It was the whole neighborhood. They had pictures. Everybody in the community was there, I'm sure, because I would have been out there too to see her really getting the casket.
And a casket on the way to the prom.
So it's some interesting things there,
to say the least.
Yes, but it's wonderful though. Like you say, you got a chance to see them at the
it is. Yeah, to see some of the students that sat in front of you, several years ago, and they still thought enough of you,
right,
to come out and they wanted us to share this moment with them. I thought it was pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's always great to reconnect, awesome. Or that they love you so much and they want you to see their growth.
Yeah,
it's a wonderful thing. I know. We've had some losses this week too, with designer Kate Spade. I was in the teachers lounge and one of the teachers was like, "Oh my God, Kate Spade passed away," and I was like, "What? I mean, are you serious?" And then only a few days later, the celebrity shoved Mr. Bourdain, and he passed away, and it's just really both from suicide. So.
That's terrible.
Our thoughts and prayers go out. And,
absolutely, to their families.
Yeah, and people need to, they need to have encouragement and a strong support system, because sometimes, when you have that, I don't know the situation, but I know sometimes there's a lot of reasons that can push people to just feel like either I've had enough or I just can't take it anymore.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, I know sometimes when you're in the family and you're the one that is the go-to all the time, or you're the one that's, the fix-it person, or, and everybody, okay.
And that can be stressful.
It can.
That's stressful, because and you don't want to say no to your family,
right?
Who might need some help, but sometimes, and it can get overwhelming.
Yeah.
When they're constantly going to you, whatever. But also too, that since you mentioned that, depression is a really sneaky illness, if you will. You can have it, sometimes not even realize it, because the stress can get that monumental and paramount where you wonder why you get into these fuck. And oftentimes, depression is something that leads to suicide.
It is.
So you have to step back, sometimes reevaluate, and then just decompress and get yourself together.
Yeah, and you have to watch it in children too. A lot of times you just think
absolutely,
kids, but children can be depressed.
They can experience it
and
show you signs.
Yeah,
show signs sometimes and not realize it,
and not even realize it. And I know sometimes you have to, like you say, just really find some type of way. One, find some help, but also, find some type of coping mechanism too.
Absolutely.
That you can release and then, feel like you again. And depression, it can come on sometimes, when you have recurrent thoughts of the past, of bad things, or things that constantly come up on you, and or just situations where sometimes people are saying things and all of a sudden you never know how that affects someone, and
absolutely.
They just, get withdrawn. But that's something that we really, really have to pay attention to. And I know next week when we do our episode, we're going to go back to the men in the community and their role, but we're also going to have, in addition, hopefully, they said they will commit, someone that has made Mentor of the Year, and they came and talked to the students about a particular app that's on the phone.
Really?
That before you send it out, it says, are you sure you want to send this? Because it gives you an opportunity to think about what you said. That's not only good for the children, but adults need that too.
Absolutely.
Because in texting and social media, it can be really, really kind of funny. You put things out there, and you know how you mean it, but you know, sometimes people read into it the wrong way.
Right. It's been received with a different kind of
Right.
attention.
And tone
And,
to it. And people can interpret their own tone and they're not actually talking. See, if you're not physically looking at someone or hearing someone, then you may think, well, we previously had this conversation, it seemed this way, now you're texting me, so they read into it, it's the negative and it might not necessarily be.
Right.
Or, you know, you just have to be cognizant. I know I try to watch and reread my text messages.
I need to do that too. Because sometimes I send text messages. I mean, I have a bad habit of sometimes misspelling some things and then sending it anyway. And then when I reread it, what I've said, I say, oh gosh, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. An educator, nonetheless.
It happens to all of us because the buttons are so small when you hit one thing.
And with the autocorrect too.
Yeah,
you know,
the autocorrect is
messes
terrible.
me
I
up,
hate
you know,
it.
yeah. It's a benefit at one point, but sometimes if you just do it so fast,
Right.
then it end up make you look a little silly.
Right.
So
And hate is a strong word. I dislike it a lot.
there you go.
I
Yeah.
very much so dislike
Exactly.
that. Because I
Exactly.
have been, you know, sending a message and then, you know, your fingers are bigger than the little squares.
All day
and
long.
then, you know, you're trying to hit something and, you know, you're trying to type 4 with the O and you hit the I and it's just ridiculous. So, and like you said, people looking like, really, y'all teachers?
Right. Right. We're still educated, Detroit. Don't give up on us.
Right,
Just pray
right,
for
right,
us.
right. Maybe we need to come up with an app.
Yeah,
better than that
yeah.
auto.
Right.
We're going to figure this one out. Okay, so we are up on our first break, and we are going to come back with our dynamic guest that we have in the studio, Mr. Edward Saunders, and we also have Adonis Flores. I'm sorry, I hate to mess up anybody's name. So they're going to be back, and we're going to be talking about the parallels of incarceration and immigration. And stay tuned, and please be prepared because this is a very emotional. It can be very emotional because we're going to tell some truths and talk about some things. So stay tuned and come back.
If you hear this message, wherever you stand, I'm calling every woman, calling every man.
Every success story starts with a spark of curiosity, of wanting more. Wayne County Community College District has more than 120 academic and career training programs and support to help you every step of the way. From registration to financial aid to career placement. Find your spark and get on a path to your best life. Register today.
We are a part of a public-private partnership to place more than 40 kiosks throughout Wayne County to allow you to pay your essential bills and delinquent taxes in one safe, convenient location.
DTE Energy introduced this kiosk program to allow Metro Detroiters greater freedom to pay your energy and other bills when and how you desire by cash, personal check, or credit card.
At the Detroit Water Department, we are pleased to join our friends so you can now pay your water bill on the DivDat Kiosk Network.
The kiosks are located in our respective downtown offices as well as Rite Aid stores and community centers across the county.
As the president of the DivDat Kiosk Network, our mission is to stamp out convenience fees and help you.
Make sure to take advantage of the no-fee kiosks to stay current on your tax, energy, and water bills. Stop by today to learn more about how to enter into a payment plan in the newly extended interest rate reduction program.
Please visit us at DTE Energy.
The Wayne County Treasurer's Office.
Or DWSD. We're here to help.
If you hear this message, wherever you stand, I'm calling every woman, calling every man. We're the generation we can't afford to wait.
Welcome back, Detroit, and we are ready to start our interview with our phenomenal guest. We have Mr. Adonis Flores. We also have Mr. Edward Saunders. And Loris and I are going to start right in to this interview talking about the parallels of incarceration and immigration. So, you know, Loris, if you want to start.
Mr. Sanders, you've been with us before on discussing incarceration systems and juvenile lifers. Can you explain to our audience briefly your role in the community and advocating for juvenile lifers? And what's that about?
I myself am a former juvenile lifer. been returned back to society for probably about 13 months now. I got out last year, July the 6th, right after the holiday. Why incarcerated? As I mentioned before, I was advocating on behalf of juvenile lifers by way of taking and presenting their cases to individuals in the media. I was prepping their, some kind of profile to take and humanize them, That was our objective then. We was attempting to take and get the legislator to take and rectify the situation of taking and having putting children inside of Michigan's prisons for the rest of their entire lives for decisions they made when they were children. The legislation never came to any, maturity, and so eventually we went to the court in regards of it. But along the way, I took and tried to help the guys to give them a human face. In addition to that, we took and contacted families and friends and asked them to go down and lobby legislators and things of that nature. So I was involved with other guys who were actually serving time, and all of us was doing this in regards to our family and our friends, etc. Since I got out, I've been advocating on their behalf as well. Okay. Yesterday, Thursday, I was released from my conviction. I was discharged. Went to see my parole agent by 12 noon, and she handed me a piece of paper acknowledging that the parole board ordered my discharge. And this was a result of the good time that had been given to us that the statute that they had created said that we couldn't have. Well, I was instrumental in taking and bringing the concern to the ACLU that statute was ex post facto, because lifers, like all inmates of the correction facility, are inclusive of the inmate population that receive good time. Right. They may never necessarily realize it until and unless they go back to court and be resentenced. And the legislators knew this when they created the law. They knew this when they drew the law up, but they meant to take and slow things down, and it was a ill-intended legislation. There are other aspects of the legislation that's being challenged, but that's just one example. Had I known that we probably wouldn't be discharged today, there are many other juvenile lifers that have recently been resentenced but was intended to take and maybe spend a few more years or several more months inside of correctional facilities that will be released immediately. Okay. In fact, when I went down to the parole office, I was one of 4 individuals that I know of that had received their discharge that particular day. It could have been more, but I knew there was at least 4 of us. So this is just one example, of my participation, in terms of juvenile lifers, but participate with you guys, taking every opportunity I can to take and make mention that these are children. These are children that made mistakes when they were children. There are now scientific evidence, not pseudoscience, but good science that says that these individuals are less culpable when they are children, but more capable of reform or rehabilitation. And we want to take and emphasize that very few of the guys, in fact 60% of the guys, have been slated to take and be resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I represent a very small minority, 40%, that's been allowed to go back to court and be resentenced. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, but I know from my own contact with these young gentlemen that they are ready to return back to society. And I believe that our public officials and others, as opposed to taking and spending time to obstruct the U.S. Supreme Court's decision, they should be doing what they can to bring forth resources, etc., to assist these young men to come back into society. We have to remember that these are individuals that spent their entire adult life incarcerated. It's not easy to return back to society after having spent that type of time. You didn't go into prison when you was an adult. So you returning back into a society where, in many instances, your parents, your grandparents, your great aunts and uncles, all of them are now gone.
Right.
So that family support, that social network is now absent. To take and have public officials taking and acting in an ill and mean-spirited way while you're trying to come back into society is very, is very disheartening. And it doesn't represent who we are as a society. The U.S. Supreme Court has made a ruling, and we should respect that ruling. That ruling take and acknowledge that these children, like any child, are capable of making bad decisions, but despite that, the evidence show that they are much capable of reforming once they get once they mature. I like to take and believe that I'm a good example of that. This is the month of Ramadan. I took and accepted the Islamic faith while incarcerated at the age of 18. I'm 60 now. This is the first time that I was able to take and observe Ramadan in a free society. I've been spending, because we're in the last 10 days of Ramadan, so I've been spending the night in the mosque, taking and praying and doing things of that nature, reading the Quran. These are the kind of things that these young men will be doing. They will be returning back to society, going to church and things of that nature, getting involved in civic organizations, etc. All of us have diverse interests. We all have diverse abilities, and we should take and allow these young men and young women to return back to society. It doesn't mean that there wasn't victims in these cases. There were and are victims in these cases. We ourselves are victims in these cases. Anytime a child is situated to take and harm someone else, it's evidence that there is something wrong in that child's life.
Absolutely.
And we shouldn't take and ignore that.
And we thank you, and you are a great example. And we are just so pleased and so proud to have you working with us and talking. And every time, we go out into the community, you're there. That's how we met you at a community event, and you are a good example of how second chances are very much so needed, in that people should not just continually be judged based on one particular aspect and stage of their life. Now, Mr. Adonis, Mr. Flores, speaking of juveniles, you are an advocate, and you work with immigration and also Michigan United, and we also met in the community, and I'm working also with you all. So can you tell us about your background and your experience with immigration and dreamers and children now that are being detained?
Well, thank you for inviting me again. I am actually an undocumented immigrant. I have DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that President Obama issued in 2012. And that's part of the main reason why I do this work. It affects me and my loved ones directly. A lot of people don't know this, but most undocumented immigrants have very deep ties to the country. In my case, my first family member that I have knowledge of to come to Michigan and live and work in Michigan is my great-grandfather, who passed away 3 years ago. He used to come work in the fields during World War II. And my grandfather's generation did the same thing. There's this trend from our hometowns that the males used to come and work in the same general area, and in our case, in our family's case, it was either the Dallas area or the Detroit area, and they did that until the Bracero program was ended at the end of the 60s, which was in backlash to the civil rights movement. As we know, there was a lot of racism and a lot of racist elected officials that were not happy with the civil rights movement. So they were trying to look for other ways of controlling the racial makeup of America, and one of those ways was by controlling who came to the country. So that was the last time that the immigration system was reformed, and it allowed a much larger number of Western European immigrants to come to the U.S. and a much smaller number of people of color from countries, black and brown countries, coming to this country. So as a consequence, my parents' generation didn't get that opportunity to immigrate as guest workers. They had to immigrate as undocumented immigrants. And it started getting more dangerous year after year, administration after administration. So fortunately, there was sort of a relief in the 80s with the Reagan administration. I'm not a particular fan of the Reagan administration, but one thing he did right was the amnesty, where he gave a pathway to citizenship to about 4 million undocumented immigrants. Unfortunately, my family was not here at that time. My mother and my father, I was not even born yet. And a lot of people in my family were not able to benefit from that. So myself, my mom, actually came to the country in 98. Actually, it was 97. I was 8 years old. And we never thought we were going to come to the U.S. My dad was a labor organizer back in Mexico, representing the small farmers, and we had a relatively comfortable life. We never lived in extreme poverty, but after NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the farmers, the small farmers in Mexico, couldn't compete with the big farms here in the U.S. So they ended up abandoning their lands and immigrating to the U.S. And I remember when I was a little kid, before these NAFTA got implemented, every family member had one or two members of the family immigrated here in the U.S. And after NAFTA, the opposite happened. The whole family came to the U.S. and only one or two members stayed back in Mexico. And that's how I ended up here. And I always knew I was undocumented. I remember being young and in elementary school, every time my mom would come home late from work because she either stayed to work overtime or she stopped on the way to buy groceries, I would enter in this panic mode where I would be afraid that she had been stopped and deported. And I know that a lot of the kids nowadays live with that same fear. I was very fortunate enough that never happened to me. But I can definitely remember that fear where I would start crying and praying to God to please make sure that my mom would come home, because I knew that if she didn't, our family was going to be separated.
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons why I do this work. But, you know, like a lot of us, we often don't wake up and take action until it impacts us really hard. In my case, the first time this really hit hard at home was when my uncle Ivan, who's the youngest of my mom's siblings, he's only 6 years older than me, so he was more like an older brother to me.
Right.
He got deported the same day President Obama took office on January 20, 2009. And that's when I realized that I had to do something. So I started looking in the community for different organizations and institutions to get involved in that knew how to do organizing, that knew how to change the laws, that could teach the members in the community how to do this. And that's when I got involved with, now we're Michigan People's Campaign and Michigan United. Back then we worked under different campaigns and different names. Most recently, my brother got deported last year, so it continues impacting my family, and that's one of the main reasons why, even though we won DACA in 2012, I didn't stop there, because I knew that we needed to keep fighting. And not only that, it was an issue about immigrant rights, but it was an issue about racial justice, and that it was closely tied to incarceration, because it's the same private prison companies that benefit and profit off of putting black bodies behind bars. These are the same companies that have contracts for detaining immigrants in detention centers, which in reality should just be called jails for immigrants, because they hold immigrants there for months for being undocumented, and if they cannot afford an attorney, they won't get provided an attorney. Immigrants don't have the right to a court-appointed attorney in immigration court. They do in the regular courts, but not in immigration court. So most immigrants cannot afford one. I forgot the number, but it's well in the ballpark of 70 to 80% of immigrants go to court without representation, and including immigrants that are children that are 5, 6, 10 years old. They have to represent themselves in court without an attorney.
A 5-year-old.
Yeah.
Trying to represent themselves. This is ridiculous. And speaking of children, now what's going on with them being detained and their parents? Can you address that and explain that? Because we're going to get soon into the labor concern, where actually how labor plays a part, and it's not just, oh, they're coming, so you know what you're in for because you came and you knew you were undocumented. We're going to talk a little bit more about how labor plays into it. But explain it right now what's going on with children and their parents being detained.
Yes, so asylum law, and I'm going to, just for full transparency, I'm not an immigration attorney. The little knowledge that I have of this is because of the work that I do in organizing. But asylum law in the United States requires that in order for you to apply for asylum because you're being persecuted, you have to show up at a port of entry, which is usually a border or an airport, and request asylum. Say, I am afraid for my life. I would like to come into your country. That is what these parents are doing. They're following the law. They're showing up at the border and requesting asylum. And they are fleeing from either gang violence or corruption or civil unrest in their home countries. They cannot wait for a regular visa application, which takes, depending on your country of origin, it could take anywhere from 10 to 40 years, in some cases even 80 years for your visa to be processed, because they'll be dead by then. It's just the reality of the world. Right. So they're running for their lives, and they cannot wait, because if they do, they're going to die. So they show up at the border and request asylum because they are fear for their lives back at home. And even though they're following the instructions that set by the way of asking asylum, the current administration is calling them illegal immigrants. See, they're always using that term because they want to criminalize everybody that is ever trying to come to this country. They're not just against immigrants coming without authorization. They're against any type of immigrants coming. The current administration wants to reduce the number of family visas. They want to reduce every kind of immigrant that can come to this country. So they're leaving people that need to come to this country to save their lives no option but to come in without inspection, to come in unauthorized. So what's happening right now is when, and this is the first time that this happens in recent decades, is when a family, a mother and children show up at the border and request for asylum. The administration is separating them, is putting the child in foster care or whatever, it's the actual words that they used, and the mother in detention. And while they're waiting for that, they actually also keep the kids in detention and in jails, in cages. The Obama administration also did this. I don't want to say Obama was a saint, but he only did it with children that show up without parents, that already had left their parents behind in their home country. And it was temporary while they found a safe place for them. But this administration, even if they came with their parent, is splitting the family up.
Well, I will say this, and I'll let Loris continue. But to see a child in that state in foster care, I have a student. It's the hardest thing when they come to make the visits at school. That child is in fear. I felt so bad. This child just looked like, what did I do? What did I do? What are they going to do to me? I had no answers. And she was almost in tears. I'm almost in tears. The principal's like, I can't stop it. They have to do what they have to do. You know, it was okay. She came back to class, but for a child to live in fear, to be away from their parents, this is not something. It's slavery. It's just like what they did with slaves to separate the family, and it is terrible. You know.
I agree, Marshall. Like I said, just hearing that this is an ongoing reality is just really it's disheartening, and as I explained before, it's gut wrenching.
It is.
It is gut wrenching, and we would there needs to be some policies put in place to really change these laws and to stop this, because this is just it's inhumanitarian. You know, it's just inhumanitarian. And Mr. Saunders, I just wanted to, one of you can explain to our viewers how this is a humanitarian crisis that we're seeing about this deportation.
Michelle mentioned that,
hold your microphone up.
Michelle mentioned that the children are expected to represent themselves as 5 years old. The same occurred in the situation with juvenile lifers. These are children. Some of them as young as 14 years old, and they are expected to take and understand the criminal justice system, the adult criminal justice system, and to represent themselves or to take and participate in preparing their defense with an attorney. Now, most adults don't discuss adult matters with children.
Absolutely.
And I'm not bashing attorneys, but most attorneys have a problem taking and discussing legal matters with other adults that are non-attorneys. So imagine an attorney, a jurist, a doctor jurist, taking and trying to speak to a child about legality. It doesn't, and many times they just, and it happened in my situation, where my attorney literally asked me to leave him alone during the trial, not to say anything. Don't bother him. I'm trying to pay attention to the witnesses and things of that nature. I'm busy trying to tell him there's witnesses that you haven't called, and I was told that, and he didn't respect me as a participant in the proceedings. And this is the case when these children are brought here. They're criminalized. They're criminalized. They are looked at as the gentleman just mentioned. They're looked at as illegal. The word, when we use this terminology, it's a propaganda. It's a propaganda where the public begins with that phrase. They look at the child as being an illegal immigrant. These are people who come to our borders in need. When someone leaves their home and go to someone else's home, there's a concern. There's a concern there. The person is not trying to home invade. They're leaving their country. They're leaving everything they know in terms of a flag, a constitution, parents, the social network, everything. They're saying none of this is working. And they come into a neighboring country, and we should have better regards for how we respond to people that show up at our borders, particularly children and women, because these are the first victims of war. These are the first victims of war, children and women, and they are the ones who are victimized the most. Right. And as a nation, we shouldn't take and do that in response to them coming to our borders.
Adonis, also, can you discuss how employment plays a part, where people are actually enticed to come? It's not like they're just sneaking to come to go to work. There is employment opportunities that are, offered to come. Can you explain that? Because, see, a lot of times people don't hear or see this. We don't see that side or hear it.
Yeah, so the first thing I want to emphasize is nobody wants to leave their home until they are left with no other options.
Right.
And not just because of civil unrest or violence in their home country, but also because of economic hardship. And I in my family, that was also the case. I remember that my mom and my dad, they never ever thought about coming to the U.S., especially coming to the U.S. as undocumented immigrants, until we were left with no option. And like most immigrants, we first explored the option of coming to the country legally. And it was until that option was gone, that we tried and they didn't accept us, that my mom was the first one to decide. And I remember it was a very difficult day when she gave us the news that she was going to come to the country as an undocumented immigrant, cross the border, because it was very dangerous. And I remember hugging her and crying her for hours because I did not know if I was going to see my mother again. But she knew that she had to do it in order to keep my brother and myself alive. And my dad wasn't willing to risk our lives, my brother's and my lives. And so he waited about a year before he finally decided, you know what, living without your mother is not the life that I want for my kids. I don't care what the law says. We got to stay together as a family. And that's when he decided, we're going to go with your mother. We're going to cross the border without inspection. And we're going to be together as a family for as long as we can, as long as we are allowed, as long as we are there before one of us gets deported, knowing that that could be a possibility. And that's when we ended up coming here. And the reason why we chose Michigan, like I mentioned earlier, was because we already had roots here. During World War II, there were farmers and the U.S. government that went to recruit workers in Mexico. And at that point, they were willing to create a legal process for them to come. But one thing that I think a lot of businesses and companies learned through the civil rights movement is that when workers are given equal rights, they tend to unionize and demand better wages and working conditions, and that hurts their profits, according to them. And by hurting, they mean instead of making 10 million, instead of making 100 million, they're only making 10 million. You know, it's not like they're going to disappear. It's just that they're gonna make less millions. So when they ended this program, they realized that they could exploit undocumented immigrants even more. There was no incentive for them to create another legal way for workers to come. And for those who they really needed, that were highly skilled and they were not willing to come as undocumented immigrants, like doctors and lawyers, they did create a legal system for them to come, the H-1B and H-1A visas, different kinds of work visas, and only some form of farm workers still were able to apply for workers' visas. But it's up to the employer to request these visas. It's not up to the worker. The employer first needs to look for workers here in the U.S. that are American citizens, and after a certain amount of period of doing ads and going to job training centers, if they don't find the workers, then they got to go to the Labor Department and request for a visa allocation so that they can bring in the workers that they need, whether it's to work in a field or to be engineers or IT workers or doctors. And then the Labor Department gives them their approval after they verify that they actually tried finding American workers and they couldn't. And then they go to the USCIS department, which is the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and actually process those visas for the workers once they find the workers, wherever they go look for them in India or China or Mexico or wherever. It's up to them to continue renewing this.
So if they don't, that's when the issue with the...
Yeah.
Okay.
That's when the workers lose their status.
Okay.
Now, a lot of people like to criminalize black and brown people.
Right.
And that is exactly what's happening again. When somebody comes to a country with a visa and it expires, which often happens in this case of workers' visas, it becomes a misdemeanor. But under the public opinion right now, they treat everybody like the most dangerous criminals that are hurting everybody in the community. And I want to say even the majority of people that are in jail here in this country shouldn't be in jail, because they're there because they need some form of rehabilitation. They made a mistake, but it was not even a dangerous it was not even a violent mistake. The majority of people, I believe very firmly that we also need to reform our justice system to keep our black and brown youth out of jail. So the same thing is happening right now. What happened to the black community during the the war on drugs and the tough on crime law with tough on crime laws, where more black bodies were criminalized for the purpose of profit, is happening now with the immigrant community. So even though it's only a civil infraction for your visa to expired, they're treated like the worst, most dangerous criminals. And the same thing is happening for people who came in without inspection in the first place, like in the case of my parents. Coming to this country without a visa is a misdemeanor. But the administration, the media, they talk about it like it's the most dangerous people coming over the border.
Right.
And the reality is that that's just not true. It's just for profit. They're trying to profit. These private prison corporations, they're lobbying in Washington D.C., and as a result, is our communities that are suffering.
Michelle, you two recall me making reference to the 13th Amendment.
Yes.
And I would like to remind our viewers, many of us, as Americans, particularly people of color, African Americans in particular, we celebrate the 13th Amendment, and others who, appreciate freedom, we all celebrate the 13th Amendment. But I want to caution, our viewers and others to remember the 13th Amendment lays out conditions for confinement, for incarceration. It doesn't just simply take and liberate anyone. It takes and say, except, the word is in the 13th Amendment, except those who are lawfully convicted and sentenced or incarcerated. Okay? And the process began with the propaganda of criminalizing, like he may mention, we speaking about when immigrants come here, how the propaganda are taken and demonizing them or criminalizing them through language. Right. This has been used, anytime we as a nation has chose to take and go to war with a people, we begin with words. The first thing that is lost in our humanity or in our civil conduct is our language. We begin to take and dehumanize individuals. And the 13th Amendment takes and is receptive of that. I don't see the 13th Amendment as something that I feel comfortable with. If I had the choice, we would have, you don't allow enslavement, we don't take and lay out conditions to put a person in servitude, and this is what the 13th Amendment does. You have to read the 13th Amendment and not just simply celebrate it. You have to read the language, and any attorney, anyone with a legal mind would tell you, be careful because of that clause there. And that's what we are saying, and this is what we do. When we take and easily fall prey to the politicians and others who take and give you the explanation as to why they treating a particular community a certain way, remember the clause in the 13th Amendment. That's what they're justifying. Right. They're justifying that to say this is why we are incarcerating them. Right. There's no reason to take a child and separate a child from his parents when they come here, desperate, fleeing from violence, in their own native country. There's no reason to take and respond to them in that way. But we want to be solution orientated. I would ask the very institutions and individuals that supported the issue in regards to juvenile lifers that included Amnesty International, the ACLU, Human Rights Watch, the Polk, and many others that came out in support of the change in regards of juvenile lifers. I would ask them, and many of them are already there supporting, but I would ask them to also take and support this issue in regards of immigrants coming to our country. And I would ask those who are already supporting immigrants to also consider the issue in regards to children that have been sentenced and put in our prisons as adults. The U.S. Supreme Court has already ruled we need to take and encourage our legislators, whether it's here in Michigan or any other place here in the United States, to do the right thing in regards to this U.S. Supreme Court's decision.
Right.
Don't put obstacles in the way of these children returning back to society. I happened to be in a room recently with a little bit more than a half a dozen young men and women that had returned back to society here.
Right.
And one of the individuals had expressed it that he had contemplated suicide since he'd been home. And I remember responding to it by pointing out, you did all those years in prison and now you're home and you consider suicide. Everyone in the circle had agreed or acknowledged that they too had contemplated suicide since they've been home. And this is a reality of the burden of these county prosecutors here in Michigan and the present attorney general that's running now for governor. This is a result of the continuous harassment with legislation and obstacles and legal filings and everything. Consider what you are doing. Right. You are not just simply posturing for legal position. You are not just simply posturing to a particular constituent. You're also affecting lives of people.
Right.
You're affecting people's hopes. These are children that came up in an adult system that has already experienced it, horrific realities.
Right.
Many of the juvenile lifers have already been victimized while in these adult systems. You know, many politicians like to take and make joke about people who commit sexual offenses when they put them into prison. They make reference to where now you're going to take and be victimized. Well, that's what happened to those children that you put in prison.
Wow.
It happens to them whether they were sexual predators or not. It happens to the children because they are the most vulnerable in the prison environment.
Right.
They are the singly most vulnerable of the prison population is those individuals that were sent to prison. I done met individuals that, hey, they may be big men's today, standing over 6 feet tall, weighing over 200 plus pounds, that done confessed to me that they had been brutally violated when they was children inside of the system. You know, and for a man to take and be able to admit to that, you know, to be able to admit to that, but it's some of the hurt that they have received.
Right.
You know, so remember, you're talking about individuals that have already been traumatized. And here you are standing behind, and you consider yourself to be somebody that's tough. You're standing behind the laws. You're standing behind the people of the state of Michigan, and you are continuously oppressing, causing oppression to people while you're doing this. And you're standing behind the victims and the victims' families while you take and continue to do this. You know, and I will ask you to be considerate of what you're doing, you know, because it's crude. It's crude, and we have learned some of these cruelties that fall off into what we are doing now. We may have individuals that take and sympathize with the immigrants, but they don't sympathize with the juvenile lifers. But you are still dealing with children. You're still dealing with children, and we should be more sympathetic.
Right. I know we're coming to a close. We have not even gotten to the root of everything because we want to talk about the Michigan People's Voice, and I'm going to give you just, if you could briefly talk about that in 1 minute, and next week I'm going to ask you to come back because we're doing a part 2 of another segment, but this ties in very well with men in the community with what you're talking about. So if you could come back next week to continue this discussion, and even, because it contributes to that too, but just for a second, explain to us about the campaign.
Yes, so the People's Voice, one of the most important places where we can fight for solutions is in politics, in the government. This year we elect a new governor, and the real election happens at the primary. That's where the good candidates are, where you don't have to choose between the lesser of two evils. You actually can choose the candidate that you like the best. So we want to encourage everybody, please vote August 7th, Tuesday, first Tuesday of August. Every election, it's the primary. So you got your favorite candidate for governor. You also have your favorite candidate for Congress in District 13. And in District 13, they're running unopposed. There's no Republicans. So the real election is August 7th. I want to encourage everybody to vote. And Michigan People's Campaign, we're doing an endorsement process. We want to form a caucus of 300 people to together decide who we want to endorse as governor. If you want more information, I want to encourage everybody to come to our orientation or visit our Facebook page, Michigan People's Campaign. And our orientations, we have one every Wednesday and every Saturday. I want to invite everybody to the next one on Saturday, June 16th at 10 a.m. in our office located at 4405 Wesson Street, Wesson, in Detroit, Michigan. It's near Livernois and Michigan area.
Okay.
And if you have one more information, again, our Facebook page is Michigan People's Campaign. You can find the events in there.
All right.
Okay. Well, we're going to bring this episode to a close. Loris and I are very, very glad that these gentlemen
Absolutely.
have come to share
Absolutely.
with us today.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, we said this is gut-wrenching. This is not something that you can listen to and not, as a human being, excuse me, and not see that, as Mr. Saunders and also Mr. Flores has said, not see the humanitarian crisis that is going on. So we are going to finish this conversation, and we hope you join us next week when we continue talking about men in the community and also continuing this conversation on the parallels of incarceration and immigration. So thank you for joining us on Empowered Living.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good week, Detroit.
If you hear this message, wherever you stand, I'm calling every woman, calling every man. We're the generation, we can't afford to wait. The future started yesterday, and we're already late. We've been looking for a song to sing. We search for a melody, search for some